Have you ever wondered whether bilateral or unilateral training is more effective at improving your performance? Well, wonder no more. So, welcome to our new series on YouTube and audio, if you're listening to it on the podcast. So this is kind of a thing we wanted to do for a while, but we obviously didn't have the time to do. But this is on kind of selecting every Monday. We're going to be picking papers that we feel are interesting, relevant, and fairly well designed, that we can kind of distill the information for you in a format where you can consume it while you're doing other activities, so you can get some knowledge on the latest research, maybe hopefully get some practical implications for your own training, or maybe just gain some useful knowledge on the world of strength conditioning, so you can kind of accrue some better learning, and hopefully you enjoy it. And today's one, thought pretty interesting, pretty basic, but it's a good study. Today's research comes from the UK. Title is A Comparison of Bilateral versus Unilateral-Biased Strength and Power Training Interventions on Measures of Physical Performance in Elite Youth Soccer Players.
Did you learn that off by heart?
I'm reading it. So aims of the study were to determine whether bilateral and unilateral strength and power training improves measures of physical performance in male youth soccer players. A secondary aim was to compare both training interventions in an attempt to determine which training method was superior at improving measures of physical performance. So our sample size was 23 youth elite soccer players. They were in an academy training system, and they had been for a few years at this stage. Their average age was 17.6. I was 17 and a half, Mom. Plus or minus 1.2 years. They had a minimum of 2 years resistance training, which was useful. 11 were put into the unilateral training group, and 12 were split into the bilateral training group. So they had a 5-week intervention. 6-week intervention, 2 times a week, in addition to their routine strength conditioning program and their soccer sessions. So this is in the pre-season for 2020. So they were doing their strength training with a strength training coach or strength conditioning coach and their normal pitch sessions, in addition to this additional interventional program. So the exercises the unilateral group selected were rear foot elevated split squats, single leg counter movement jumps, single leg drop jumps, and single leg broad jumps. The bilateral group were doing regular old back squats. Everything was to at least parallel. They had a consistency measure using a resistance band set up in the squat rack. The bilateral group were also doing counter movement jumps, drop jumps, and broad jumps. So the bilateral group's program essentially was 3 sets until power output for the back squat was reduced by 10% of their maximum power value. So they did this for 3 sets, and then they did 2x5 drop jumps, 2x5 horizontal drop jumps, 2x5 counter movement jumps, and 2x5 broad jumps. So oh my God, where's my piece of paper? Is that it? Sorry. So the single leg, the unilateral group essentially repeated the exact same program, but with their single leg, their unilateral movements. So they did rear foot elevated split squats. They did 3 sets until it reduced by 10% of their power output, and then they did 2x5 single leg counter movement jumps, 2x5 horizontal drop jumps, 2x5 single leg broad jumps. And then what was tested, so the metrics, their way of testing what their physical performance output was single leg output, interlimb asymmetry, bilateral deficit, change of direction speed, linear sprinting, and jump height.
Yeah. So what Gerf was talking about there, so he went through like the training protocols for each, obviously with like a kind of test, intervention, retest design like this. You'd have the exact same testing happening at the start as you would at the end. So he talked about strength, like their kind of strength test at the start would be, in this case, it was a 1 rep max on the back squat. It was a 1 rep max on the rear foot elevated split squat. It was a counter movement jump. So that was done. Counter movement jump is basically you start with your hands over your head, you swing with your arms down, and you jump as high as possible. So if you just told somebody to do like a completely natural maximum vertical jump, that's the jump they do. Then you had obviously the single leg versions of those. So single leg counter movement jump left, single leg counter movement jump right. You then had a broad jump. So that's moving laterally as far as, so basically just covering as much ground in front of you with a normal jump as possible. Then you had single leg broad jump left, single leg broad jump right. Then they tested reactive strength index. So reactive strength index is something you'll see a lot of the time in studies like this. It's a combination of max jump height with kind of reaction speed on the ground. It takes place over like a battery of tests. Or there is another way of calculating reactive strength index, where you basically gradually increase the height of a box, and you'll be measuring their reaction time on the ground, so contact time on the ground, in combination with maximum height of the jump they were able to achieve. So reactive strength index is something you'd commonly see in papers to do with agility and sprinting, and jump performance. Then they did single leg versions of those, so single leg reactive strength index left and on the right. Then they had a 10-meter sprint and a 30-meter sprint. They had a 5:05 test left, 5:05 test right. What a 5:05 test is, it's a common test of agility. So you'd have 3 cones set up. So you'd have a cone at 0 meters, say the goal end line. You have a cone at 10 meters and a cone 5 meters beyond that again, so at 15 meters. So if we call those cone A, B, and C, I start at A. Once I sprint past B, my timer starts. So in this case, it was done with timing gates. I'll then go to cone C, so the furthest one away. I turn around on the left-hand test. I turn to my left, and I come back past cone B and all the way to cone A again. So it basically just tests your turnaround from B to C and back to B again. It's a test of your ability to turn 180 degrees. And you'll see some variance in people's lefts and rights that we're going to talk about later. Then we have change of direction left and change of direction right. There was other things they calculated. So when you do all these tests, you obviously get like simple outcomes. Like you do your 1 rep max test, you'll get a simple outcome for your max strength or your bilateral strength. But then you have other things that will be calculated post hoc, which will be bilateral deficit and asymmetries from right to left. When you look at like their testing protocols, they had 2 different days of testing. So day 1, they did counter movement jump. They did single leg counter movement jump. So they did all the jumping basically on day 1. Then they took a 72-hour break, and they did day 2, which was 1 rep max testing on their back squat and 1 rep max testing on their rear foot elevated split squat. Before each of the days, they had 24 hours rest. So obviously in the 72 hours break in between day 1 and day 2, they probably had 2 days of training, then another rest day, and then they did their testing again. So that's what the testing itself looked like. Okay, so then looking at the results, right? Obviously when you're looking at papers, and this is the first kind of paper review we're doing as a video, so we're going to try and just drip feed people information about kind of reading scientific papers and not just overload this too much. But when you're looking at papers, and you'll see like there is differences, and then there's differences which are significant. So when you're looking over papers, most of the time when you go to a results section, you'll see there'll be a star or a cross next to the differences that are significant. Significance just like is a statistical calculation, and may not actually be that it's going to make a significant difference to you in your training. But certainly you need to look for significance in your results data. Okay, so we'll start with the unilateral group, right? So they had a significant increase in 1 RM for their rear foot elevated split squat. They had significant difference in their single leg counter movement jump on the left side. They had significant difference in the single leg broad jump on the left side. They had significant difference in 10-meter sprint speed. And they had significant difference in the 5:05 reaction or 5:05 agility test on the right side. Then our bilateral group, so the group that we're training with both legs, had significant difference in back squat 1 RM, in rear foot elevated split squat 1 RM, in broad jump, in 10-meter sprint speed and 30-meter sprint speed, and change of direction left. Okay, so what does this data mean, right? So we have significant changes or significant increases in performance following the intervention on both sides. the obvious thing here, right, is training specificity, one out. What we expected to happen would happen. So the bilateral group got better at bilateral things. So their broad jumps, their 10 meters, their 30 meter sprints, their back squat 1RM. They also got like the rear foot elevated split squat is something that like is slightly bilateral, and they also got better at that, right? Then there's some interesting findings in the fact that you have asymmetry between the left hand side and the right hand side, and the training effects from training both legs. So obviously, like, they were doing unilateral work, but they were training both legs as they were doing unilateral work. So they had an increase in their 1RM rear foot elevated split squat, which is to be expected. The interesting stuff comes when you look at the counter movement jump left and the single leg broad jump right. So like both of the single leg jumps on the left hand side seem to significantly improve, whereas on the right hand side they weren't shown to significantly improve, right? This could be due to any number of limitations, but a very, very likely limitation is the level of asymmetry between left and right foot on near elite soccer players, or like elite soccer players, is going to be significant, right? So if I'm constantly, even though I might be very, very proficient off both feet, but if I'm constantly kicking or striking a ball with my right leg, my left leg, the level of strength and stability to be able to hold my body in one place as I swing the other leg as hard as I possibly can, is obviously going to develop some asymmetries.
And like that could be up to 12 years of kicking a ball, so they could have started when they were something like 5 years old.
Yeah.
Kicking a ball, especially if they're elite youth and they're in academy since maybe they were like 12. So they definitely started playing football or soccer when they were like 5 years old.
Yeah.
So the amount of repetitions, and as Ira said, the maximum repetitions, maximum force in their predominant leg, the one that they've favoured, is massively, like, you would almost never use your least favorite leg, like your lame leg as such, in terms of like when you're playing soccer or football or any of these.
And that's
things.
like the non-dominant leg is going to be so much stronger in terms of stability and actual strength due to the fact that you're constantly standing on that non-dominant leg. So we'll talk about limitations of the study and how we might design the study a small bit better to take that into account later on. But it's an interesting one. It's also an interesting one when you take the change of direction test, right? So the agility test of 505, when they're turning to their right hand side, is then found to be made stronger by the intervention, which turning to your right hand side, your right leg becomes kind of inert, and it would be the left leg you're driving off, having turned to your right hand side. So all of that data, or all of those data, are kind of backing up and leading up to the fact that there's possibly asymmetries there prior to starting, and that training effect might be different from one side of the body to the other. Besides that, the data shows that training specificity is usually the number one thing. So like, it's like every training program in the world, you need some sort of specificity to get better, to get faster, stronger, more powerful, just as you'd expect.
The back squat group got better at back squatting. The unilateral group got better at unilateral rear foot elevated split squats. Like, everyone got better at the stuff that they were training, you know, which is absolutely of no surprise. Were you happy with the... Oh, no.
Yeah, so like, I think the good things about this study, right?
Yeah.
They're being done in a fairly well-trained group. Like, for people who are used to reading scientific studies, and especially in the realms of strength and conditioning and like any kind of physiological adaptation, it's always young adult males are used. And if it's in a training intervention, they usually have 2 years of strength training. So I think a lot of the time, or almost all the time, the studies that have those criteria are taking college kids.
Yeah.
And college kids who have varying degrees of strength training, like using a group like this who fulfill those criteria you see in almost any strength training study, but actually fulfill it in a very structured way, and where you understand the amount of training and the level of experience the kids have before they do it.
Yeah.
Like, that's a very, very definite strength of the study.
Yeah, so like the pros they had at least 2 years of strength training, and like that was under, as they said in the study, under like the guidance of qualified strength and conditioning coaches. Now obviously we have no idea of the quality of those strength and conditioning coaches, who they were, and obviously,
but they're probably good. Like, they're in a Premiership academy.
There's a good chance that if they were not good at their job, they would have been out of it at this stage. But so they had at least 2 years of resistance training. They would have had academy training would probably started somewhere around 12, 13 years old. So they would have started with structured training environments. They like manifesting themselves as athletes, and that's their goal in life, is to be one of the highest paid athletes in the world, in terms of earning like upwards of between 50 and like £300,000 a week. So like they were not half-assing this. Like many of these were gunning for this, so they were taking their we can say with some good certainty that they were taking their training as seriously as you can expect any teenagers to take it, in terms of like kind of a private environment, a non-state sponsored environment here. So we had great subjects. We liked most of the exercise they chose were good. I like, as in most of them. So we have one issue, we'll get that in the cons in a minute. Any other pros you liked about it?
Yeah, like, so we have like cons listed out, so obviously they're in my brain already, but so another pro of this is that they're using very valid measures, right? So reactive strength index is something that will come up all the time. It's very, very well studied. In terms of like testing their back squats, like really good, like well documented testing protocols. They're using movements that the players will be very, very used to doing. So like counter movement jumps, broad jumps, those 505 agility drills. There's nothing like super flashy there. No. They're not like, this is a study that you could go away and get a first year sport and exercise science class to replicate and probably get very, very similar results. So like you have to have positives, or like that's a very definite positive, is it's super relatable, it's very repeatable, and like the reliability of the measures they picked is a significant thing in itself.
Yeah, like the spectrum, the sheer amount of physical performance measures that they used were significant. There was a lot of, and I don't mean that in terms of like statistically, like it was just a lot of measures they used, which is, with the more the better realistically in some ways. So you never want to have too little in terms of things like this. So they were really looking to gather some useful data. So the pros were, the vast majority of the exercises were good. They were simple. We had good quality athletes. We had a reasonable number of athletes, I suppose.
I think that is like that's right on the border.
And then we had a lot of measures taken, and they seem to be taken fairly decently. By the looks of things. So they were in a good environment for the study, and I think so. Overwhelmingly, there's a lot of pros to the study.
Yeah, very definitely.
Won't be like this. Now, some of the cons would be that number is, while it's significant enough to be like that's an interesting study and there's useful results from that, it's probably not enough in terms of like you probably want several different runs of this over the years, maybe with maybe 4 or 5 times the number of athletes to really get a significant number of, or significant kind of results from this, I would think.
Yeah, like the limitations they listed were like, as far as I remember, they're athletes who were doing other training at the same time. So like this was done in an off season or a pre-season block, but they're still doing other training as it's going on, right? So there's other training effects happening. The other things they listed were like n equal to 23. Like if you do a basic power analysis, you'll probably, like 23 is probably not far off. But getting populations like this where it's homogenous and everyone's really similar, you should be able to get a group of 30 or 35 athletes for this. So like the amount of people who are doing it isn't huge. They had one other limitation listed, but like the other limitations aside from what they've spoken about, and we kind of mentioned it earlier, is the rear foot elevated split squat isn't solely unilateral. So the same way that if I'm doing an assisted pistol squat and I'm holding on to something each side, it's not a pistol squat. So like you get some assistance from the other leg, and there is a very definite training effect happening on the other leg when it's raised up behind you.
And considering that rear elevated foot squat, split squat, was their kind of only strength movement in the unilateral group, it's kind of it does muddy the waters a little bit, because all the other movements listed are primarily power movements. So when we have the back squat, that we know for definite that is a bilateral movement. But when we have the one unilateral movement, that is kind of a little bit hazy in terms of is it unilateral, bilateral. Now, it's obviously primarily unilateral, that's fine. But we'd probably, if at all possible, and there might have been reasons why they didn't, but if you would have looked at something, maybe we were kind of throwing out there, maybe if they did something like a box step up, but instead of kind of like a pistol setup as opposed to on a box where the leg is to the side, where you could, if you eliminated the initial kickoff, so sometimes we do box step ups, you kind of kick off with your right leg whether you intend to or not, but if you something more definite in terms of unilateral strength, and there's definitely possibilities out there, especially if you're looking for like a short 6-week period, you probably could figure out something that's a little bit better. Like
I think something like with a lot more constraints, so like where you have a leg shackled, or like you're in some sort of apparatus that would stop you moving your other leg, like those are used extensively in other studies, and I think they definitely could have been used here. It's obviously why, like, it's obvious why they weren't, right? So you have a group of players that probably do rear foot elevated split squats all the time. This study is being done purely because they want to know this within a club or within a setup. So I think if you wanted to be a lot more rigorous, you could do something like that, definitely. Gerf talked about it earlier, like 6 weeks. 6 weeks isn't long enough for these kind of, like, if you really wanted to be rigorous and you really wanted to find out, you'd do probably 10 weeks, then you'd do a washout period, then you'd swap the groups over and you'd do 10 weeks again. Another limitation they mentioned was the fact that they didn't have any group where they do a combined training study. So realistically, the best result is probably going to come from some combination of the two training methodologies. So you'd want a group that does unilateral and bilateral work, and you'd probably get the highest level of significance in terms of training effect from that group.
So I don't know if we mentioned that, but one of the cons was they were doing, so in addition to their football pre-season training, their specific sport-specific training, you know, like their pitch sessions, they were also doing another structured strength conditioning program, which almost certainly would have impacted them in terms of fatigue. Yeah. And like their kind of motivation to go to the gym, their ability to perform the movements to their maximum ability, like their coordination would have been impacted without a doubt, considering you mentioned they had 6 pitch sessions and then 3 gym sessions in addition to this, I think. So another 2 sessions on top of this, which are very fatiguing exercises, is one of the issues. So ideally you would have them not do any other training, or just their pitch training and not any other strength conditioning programming. But
yeah, and then like the last limitation I would say is, like, it was clear from the evidence that some sort of asymmetry was affecting the data, and then like having the athletes specifically from a sport that has asymmetries inherent in it. I think like if that was a netball team or a handball team, you might just get slightly cleaner data, and you wouldn't be seeing those kind of left side favoured or right side favoured in your outcomes.
Yeah, if it's something like rugby or something where only like the fly half
they were just so broken that they didn't have to train.
Yeah. Well, we want to talk a little bit about the practical implications for the people watching, for you guys, because we want to make these studies relevant to you and any outcomes, so you can kind of not only, so from an academic point of view where you're just learning things is interesting, of course, but also we want to be helping you educate
yourself. Love learning things.
Help educating you on your own training. Like, is there any kind of principles here or specific details even that you could use in your own training? So one of the things we saw from this is essentially that specificity is a thing which we're under no surprise.
No.
So obviously specificity
is the backbone of all adaptation.
Yeah.
And it's very clear here, right? If you go and look at this paper, and the link will be in the description, and you look at the outcomes or the results tables, you'll see improvements, and you'll see like everything improved across all of them. I think one metric might have gone down over the course of the training intervention, but almost everything improved. But that doesn't mean, like, unless it's significant, there's no real point in looking at it. It also means, like, just because something is significant doesn't mean it's actually going to have a practical implication to you. But definitely, like, you can see from the data that training unilateral work makes you better at unilateral work, and training bilateral work makes you better at bilateral work. And that's some combination, like, that's really what we want moving forward, is some combination of these two should make you better at everything.
Because we saw that the bilateral group improved on some things that the unilateral group didn't improve on. So they had a huge list of like physical performance measures that they measured. So their bilateral group improved things that a unilateral group didn't improve on, and then vice versa. Our unilateral group improved on things that our bilateral group didn't improve on. So the aim of they don't know if it made it better at soccer, but they know they made it better at certain aspects of their physical performance. So you, as a most likely 99% sure that you're not an elite soccer player, but you are maybe you might be an athlete or gym or strength training or powerlifter or weightlifter, it should be evident, like from these results, that the best thing you can do is do a combination of both. So we always say the thing about like a rising tide lifts all boats. So a variance of both of these, bilateral work in conjunction with your unilateral work, will lift up all of these areas, and it can only make you a better athlete if you do both of them. There doesn't appear to be a whole lot of negatives. Now, obviously, if you take one too far, you're obviously going to have negatives. But as a whole, like with sensible programming, with unilateral and lots of bilateral work and some unilateral work, you will improve everything.
Yeah.
Anything else to add, Fitz?
No. Let us know in the comments below which areas you are more interested in. So like if you're interested in study design, let us know. If you're just interested in like us covering more studies and getting more snippets of this out there, let us know.
Yeah.
Or if you want some deep dives into statistical analyses, you can let us know too.
You can let Fitz know.
I fucking love him.
Yeah. Thanks for watching. So it really does help if you leave a like. And it also lets us know, so not only for us when you leave likes, for like the YouTube algorithm or whatever, and other people know, but it lets us know that people watching, you guys who are supporting us, what you like watching. So when you click like on something, it lets us know that you like this type of video, or you like something we did in this, so we can do more of that. So it's also for you too as well, to help kind of improve the content that you want to get out of us.
Yeah.
And comment and subscribe.
Pew, pew, pew.
Thanks.